Hello, and welcome to our panel on mental health and minority men, part of the All in Chicago 2020 virtual event series. My name is Laura Cerisi Starr, and I am the Director of Development and Communications at CommunityHealth. CommunityHealth is the largest volunteer-based free health center in the United States. We provide primary and specialty care, prescription medications, mental health and dental services, health education, and lab testing, including COVID testing, on the west side of Chicago. Our patients have no health insurance, and we provide all of our services to them at no charge. We do this with the support of over 1,000 volunteers, partnerships with dozens of institutions, and donations from generous people like you. Thank you for being here and for supporting Community Health. I would especially like to recognize our many sponsors who are supporting this year's All In series, including Baxter, Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Illinois, AbbVie, Lundbeck, the Joseph and Bessie Feinberg Foundation, West Monroe Partners, and many others. I encourage you to visit our website, allin-chicago.org, to see the complete list of speakers, read the bios for our incredible speakers, and check out the rest of the month's events. Finally, I want to recognize this year's All In Executive Leadership Council. We are privileged to have 4 outstanding leaders serving on the council this year. Their great insights and support have been instrumental in bringing this year's series to life. Thank you to Joe Flanagan, Kimberly Hobson, Stacy Lindau, and John Maples for your contributions this year. The goal of the All In Chicago series is to bring together leaders from many different industries and segments of our population to talk about how we can work together to ensure every resident has access to the right care in the right place at the right time. While we are doing things a little differently with the virtual broadcast this year, Community Health has been hosting these conversations around access to healthcare in Chicago since 2015. This year, as we are all living with a global pandemic, the conversation around access feels more relevant than ever. COVID-19 has placed a new and persistent strain on everyone's mental health over the last 6 months, but the country is also finally reckoning with racial inequity on a massive scale. Cultural norms around mental health can impact men, and particularly men of color, in significant and challenging ways during the pandemic and beyond. This conversation about how we can work together to help each other heal may be the most important one of our All In series. It is my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today's conversation, Joseph Harrington. Joe is a native Chicagoan, and he has worked in the fields of education, social services, mental health, healthcare, and public health. During his career, he has worked at academic medical centers and community hospitals, and he previously served as an assistant commissioner at the Chicago Department of Public Health and retired in 2017 as the State Health Department's Regional Health Officer for Cook County, where he also served as an administrative law judge. He currently serves on a number of boards, including the Board of Directors at Community Health. So with no further ado, I will welcome Joe to our virtual stage to introduce our panelists. Thank you for being here, Joe.
Thank you, Laura. As we head into our panel discussion, I'm asking each of our panelists to turn on their cameras so you can see who is speaking during this conversation. One quick housekeeping item. This conversation is happening live, so please be sure to submit your questions for our panelists. We'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible during the next 50 minutes. Just submit your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Now I'd like to introduce our panel. Arturo Carrillo is the Director for Violence Prevention and Health Initiatives for Brighton Park Neighborhood Council, where he is a licensed clinical social worker and offers free long-term trauma-focused mental health services for residents of Chicago's west and southwest sides. Jahmal Cole is the founder and CEO of My Block, My Hood, My City, where he created an exposure-based education program for teens and a network of volunteer initiatives that serve Chicago communities year-round. Jahmal is an inspiring leader, great speaker, and in high demand, so we're grateful to have him here with us today. Prince Daniels Jr. is a former NFL running back, practitioner of mindfulness and meditation, author, and entrepreneur. He founded and leads an organization called The Game Beyond the Game. Donald Dew is the president and CEO of Habilitative Systems Incorporated, a behavioral health and human services organization providing programs and services for children and families with special needs. Carl Evans is Senior Director of Operations at Hope for the Day, a nonprofit movement empowering the conversations on proactive suicide prevention and mental health. And last, we have Alex Martinez, a bilingual mental health provider for Chicago for Children's Home and Aid. He primarily works with youth at Schubert Elementary School in the Belmont-Cragen area of Chicago. Welcome, panelists. Before we get started, I just want to remind those of you who are watching that you can submit questions for panelists using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to write your questions at any time. Again, we'll get to as many as we can during this program. I'm going to start, and I have questions for each of our panelists. I'm going to start with Arturo. Arturo, our communities are under more pressure now than ever. How does society expect men to deal with these pressures and traumas? What impact does that have?
Well, thank you for the question. Thank you for the invitation. I appreciate having the opportunity to be part of this amazing panel with these amazing speakers and be part of this very important conversation. To answer your question, I feel men are entirely left out in many cases, right? We know that harm has come upon our communities. Low-income communities of color have been disproportionately harmed by inequalities and generations of trauma. And a lot of that falls down on the individual. In many cases, of course, in our communities, we see the hurt that falls on young men, on adult men. And in many ways, the system keeps us out of getting access to care, to the services that we need until, unfortunately, people get caught up in the system, right? And so part of my work as a licensed clinical researcher and practitioner has been to understand what are the barriers to care when it comes to accessing mental health services for residents of low-income communities of color, but in particularly also my personal interest has been in understanding how men access care. One of the things that we've seen, unfortunately, is that also there's been generations of disinvestment, particularly here in Chicago. We see that in many ways also what the mental health crises that we're seeing today, we have the highest rates of Black male suicide in a while in Chicago and Cook County. The rates are already surpassing last year's rates. We also see, many of our mental health problems and issues being addressed by the criminal justice system, right? We have the biggest mental health provider in the country in Cook County Jail, right? What we're seeing essentially is a moment of reckoning. We start seeing where generations of disinvestment in our city's public infrastructure to access mental health services in communities that are at high need we're now coming to realize the impact that's had after so many generations. Just to give everyone an example, the city of Chicago used to have 19 public mental health clinics that were made available to offer free services. Now we're down to 5, right? So as an investment in our public infrastructure goes down, we're seeing more and more the attention to mental health happening when it is at a moment of crisis, right? When people are on the verge of being incarcerated or hospitalized, or Lord forbid, sometimes causing self-harm, right? So our conversation today is very important for the fact that we have an amazing panel of men here who are actively trying to do something about it. In my experience, through my research, I've seen more and more that men actually are interested in receiving help and support. It's where do you turn when you need that support, and how do you get connected to those resources that becomes the biggest problem. What we're seeing is stigma is becoming less and less of a barrier, and access to care is becoming, as always, kind of one of the biggest barriers that we're seeing when it comes to accessing care. So again, hearing from our panelists today, hearing from the collective experience of our audience, how can we invest and push for increased investment in accessing services for men, and how can we engage men to be more open to accessing services? And I'm looking forward to that conversation that we're here to engage with today on this topic. Thank you.
Thanks, Arturo. I'm going to turn now to Donald Dew. Donald, I'm sure you're familiar with transgenerational trauma. I'm going to ask you, How does trauma get passed down through generations? How can community engagement help?
Thank you so much, Joe. And it's, again, a pleasure to be on this forum to talk about this very critical issue today. First of all, let me just say that, you know, trauma is in very simple terms, a very deep and emotional wound. When we talk about generational trauma or historical trauma, we're looking at this notion of how does it get passed down from generation to generation. You know, when we witnessed George Floyd being assassinated, uh, I immediately experienced an episode of PTSD. I remembered as a young child growing up on the west side of Chicago and a white policeman putting me and my friends face down on the ground as we were out there trying to play a softball game and just using the term, he said, "Nigga, if you move, I'll blow your brains out." And I'm saying to myself in that moment that that memory came back. And how many different memories have flashed in the minds of African Americans and other persons who have been damaged in so many traumatic ways whenever that experience manifests itself. We've heard it said that hurt people hurt people. And we've also realized that that is very, very true when it comes to just turning against oneself and internalized feeling, if you will, that, you know, I don't count, I don't matter. And then that anger, that feeling of having to lash out is thrust on to those who are near and dear to us. We all know about ACEs and how they, in fact, relate to potentially historical drama, you know, or trauma. We realize that in drama and trauma. I've been saying that quite a bit, so I'm saying it again. I've been trying to say, and I go from time to time with a very simple statement. You know, if there's no drama, there's going to be no trauma. If there's no stress, there's not going to be any mess. But we realize that there's a lot of drama in our society, and subsequently, there's a lot of trauma. And as our children experience, you know, adverse child experiences, and as we look at, again, over and over again, the experience of violence and trauma in our community, then we realize that over and over again, this experience gets repeated generation after generation. So we realize that with the ACEs, there can also be some disrupted neural development. My good friend, Dr. Bell, talked about also the continued prevalence of fetal alcohol syndrome and how that could be dealt with and corrected. We also realize that, you know, generational trauma can be passed on as a result of social, emotional, and cognitive impairment. We also realize that there's the adoption of health risk behaviors or maladaptive behaviors based on what we experience in terms of institutional racism. We realize that also disease and disability and other societal ills that really directly relate to the social determinants of health are experienced, you know, generally within the African American population, and in particular, you know, persons who are experiencing poverty-stricken conditions. And we also realize that early death is passed on. I mean, how many times do we hear within our community that, well, you know, mama died at such an age or daddy died at such an age? I mean, that idea, that thinking is passed on generation after generation. We've heard about epigenetics and how epigenetics is the experience of previous generations being passed on and affecting who we are and how we think. Do we think about possibilities or do we think about impossibilities? When we look at historical trauma and the experience of post-traumatic slave syndrome, as it's been expressed in a number of different publications, and realizing the impact that slavery has had over 400 plus years, what I've been continually saying is that after 400 plus years of trauma and terror in the African American community, you know, one would expect that that's going to be internalized to some extent and passed on from generation to generation. For example, now how Black folks have to teach, you know, especially their young sons, how to act when they're stopped by policemen. The stress factor, seeing those flashing lights in your rear car window, that's an internalized way of being and acting. And subsequently, you know, folks experience a tremendous amount of stress as it relates to that. But, you know, when Dr. Joy DeGroy talked about the post-traumatic slave syndrome, she talked about all these internalized experiences within the slave experience and how that was passed on from generation to generation. We realized that ongoing methods of Jim Crow, the new Jim Crow, and other types of institutional racism, you know, impacts our community and continues to impact our community. You know, and then there's this notion of the ghetto and the super ghetto and the welfare syndrome and the welfare moms and on and on and on. And these systemic activities continue to reinforce the attitude and the behavior that, you know, we don't count, we don't matter, that it's okay for us to be at the lowest realm of the totem pole. You know, I'm here to say that, you know, we have to engage in the types of institutional building that will help neutralize these generational impacts of trauma. That's one of the reasons why we developed the Westside Community Triage and Wellness Center, to not only divert people from going into the criminal justice system and the emergency rooms and psychiatric admissions, but to give folk an opportunity to deal with, you know, the stress daily, the internalized trauma, you know, the intergenerational trauma, and to look at ways in which they can, you know, work in wellness modes and learn about yoga and Tai Chi and breathing techniques and auto, you know, suggestions and cognitive behavioral approaches and so on down the line. So we have to be able to teach our children now how to begin to deal with these ill effects so that it's not passed on to the next generation.
Thanks a lot, Donald. Next, I'm going to go to Alex. Alex, your question is, how have you seen trauma affecting children, and how do you work on that with the kids at Schubert?
So thank you for the question. I appreciate you know, being part of this panel. I think it's an amazing topic to talk about, and something I was really looking forward to. To answer your question, so growing up in a Latino household and serving a majority Latino population, I think it all stimulates like from the household environment. So growing up myself, I was often like told like have this like machismo mentality where we're supposed to like mask our emotions, men don't cry, and I would be actually physically abused for showing my emotions and crying and stuff. So it's something that I've noticed also as a trend with kids that I work with now, just seeing parents kind of in the same mentality of this like an old school mindset where they do the same things to their children. So one of my struggles is having fathers actually, before kids having their kids see a therapist, they'll often say it's a waste of time. Why does my kid need a therapist? They can talk to their mother, they can talk to me. So it's been a struggle trying to get them on board. One of the things that I try to do with these parents is trying to get fathers to see that, you know, seeing a therapist doesn't mean that there's something wrong with you. It can mean that you want personal growth. It could mean that you want your kids to learn how to cope with difficult situations that may arise, help with challenging negative thinking patterns. And it's just been an ongoing thing that I've struggled with parents, because these fathers are just not for therapy. And if the parents aren't on board with therapy and having these kids talk about things going on in their lives, their struggles in class, I mean, there's bullying, there's depression, there's anxiety. These kids are having to deal with all these emotions, and if they have nobody to talk to, it's just something that keeps going on. And it's been a difficult process to try to like get these fathers to, you know, see the benefits of having their kids in therapy. One of the things my agency has actually tried to do recently is start a Fatherhoods Initiative project, where we're trying to get fathers involved into family therapy, into our counseling services, so that they can see like what the benefit of therapy is and how it looks like, and just allowing them to just be more accepting of it.
Thanks, Alex. I'm going to go to Carl now. Carl, what strategies do you think need to be in place to break down the obstacles for accessing mental health services? How can young people help each other?
Well, so the primary obstacle, I mean, there's a number of different realities around costs and the physical availability of services being there. Oftentimes, one of the biggest challenges before those brick and mortar realities is just getting the conversation going. Unfortunately, as you've heard before, a key component of all these conversations on mental health is that suicide, for instance, and any sort of mental health crisis is ultimately a situation of untreated or undertreated mental health challenges. And these are all escalating in a culture of concealment and silence. So the most consistent obstacle beyond the very real institutional limitations and deficiencies that might be out there is a sort of a silence of stigma. Getting people to talk about it is that first step. After that, there's very real issues we might have to confront. So talking about this is not just so simple as saying, hey, talk about your mental health, because as you've just heard previously, we've inherited not just, this isn't a Facebook thing, this isn't a 21st century thing, a millennial thing, we've inherited centuries of conditioned false beliefs about mental health that ultimately all correlate down to a sense of competency. That the misled belief that things based on your thoughts, feelings, and emotions were somehow directly linked to your willpower or your character, and having any sort of real and natural mental health challenge, whether it's a psychological injury, trauma, or it's a genetic basis, internally developed thing, it was somehow your fault, somehow something that was wrong with you. And what this has done is shaped our communities to, based on stigma, to how we treat mental health. And it's visible in 3 different ways. We can readily appreciate that stigma shapes the individual's response to mental health, feeling shame and embarrassed and not wanting to communicate. But the same level of stigma also impacts how the community treats mental health. We don't make resources visible. We don't make access to information visible. We don't normalize those conversations in our communities and our families. So even if you are going through a mental health challenge, you very likely wouldn't know where to turn, even though you may recognize something's wrong. You may not have the words for it. And then third, we can see this institutionally, that stigma sort of permeates in the way we treat mental health at an institutional level, where one, our communities don't make a high priority of it. So resources and access to services is pretty minimal. Shutting down facilities, not enough hospital beds, ineffective or inconsistent treatment where it might be available are big issues. But it also creates, at an even more granular level, the false illusion that there's a hierarchy to mental health. So a lot of people operate under the belief that some mental health challenges are more important than others. There's inconsistencies with understanding who is impacted by mental health, who can be traumatized, what is trauma, et cetera, et cetera. So strategies to deal with this is we have a 3-pronged sort of approach to what you have to do, because the long story short is, if we want to have a deeply ingrained change and improvement on mental health, there's institutional policies that have to change and things like that, but none of that's going to move unless we change the social policy on mental health. Until we get our communities, the parents, the adults, schools, community centers, governing bodies, to recognize that it's okay not to be okay, to recognize that mental health is a very real and natural and organic part of our reality, and then it impacts every single person. So that begins first with outreach. You've got to normalize this conversation. We can't just have mental health be something that we're talking about just in May or September, or when someone of high visibility dies by suicide, or when mental health in other adverse ways sort of blows up in our face. And I'm not just talking about sort of like mass shooters or things like that, but in very real ways that it blows up in our face, and people's inability to function professionally, academically, or interpersonally. Outreach, so normalizing the conversation to sort of remove those stigmas, part one. We need to and can be implementing education on mental health to empower individuals to recognize and practice self-care. We can be doing that as early as adolescence, and stigma makes us think that we should only be talking about mental health by high school. And by that point, people could already be in the early onsets of any number of genetic-based mental illnesses. They could have likely already encountered instances that had been traumatic in their lives before. So creating education as early and as often as possible, academically and through the family and domestic environment as well. And then really that's taking those 2 things, outreach and education, and creating tools and basic skills for people to recognize the earliest signs and symptoms of mental health challenges. That's what we would think of as peer-to-peer prevention, because right now the traditional approach to mental health, if you look at the very essential things that are out there, lifelines, first responders, safety nets under bridges, all these kind of things, all of these are reactive, okay? And so the most aggressive and well-funded tools in mental health right now are waiting for people to reach a point of crisis. So you have this gigantic gap between when someone could be experiencing a mental health challenge that could take them weeks, months, years, decades to reach a point of crisis, and the most visible services are almost exclusively focused on crisis only. So that becomes the next thing, is creating a sort of peer-to-peer intervention system that's focused on early intervention, early recognition systems. And through that, you can create a pathway that disrupts the highest risk factors for suicide and mental health crisis, as opposed to just continuing to, and remember, current systems are needed, but our entire focus historically has been on reaction to crisis stage instead of trying to mitigate escalation. So that's the sort of general process that we're after.
Thank you, Carl. There are a couple of things you brought up. One is the issue of policy, and we're going to address that toward the end of this conversation. The other thing, you talked about self-care, and I think that's a good introduction to the question I have for Prince. Prince, how can mindfulness and meditation help when someone is faced by so many challenges in their day-to-day lives? And how do we start that practice?
Okay, beautiful. Thank you. Thank you guys for having me on this platform. I'm really honored. And how can mindfulness be helpful? Well, when you look at how we are structured as human beings, it's from a hierarchy standpoint. We have our spirit, our mind, and our body. Our spirit has a desire or ignites something inside of us that tells our mind, hey, we want to accomplish this, or we want to do this. And then our mind tells our body, let's do this. And so our body is like a byproduct of what the mind has just projected. So mindfulness is a great way for us to start internally reversing and engineering all of the trauma that we've experienced over the years. You see, what we are familiar with is whenever we close our eyes, the only thing that we do is go to sleep. And that's how we escape. But we usually go to sleep in an unconscious manner. So whenever you can start learning how to practice mindfulness, and I'm a big advocate for meditation, which is not a religion, or a philosophy, it's just a practice that allows you to access a high level of focus, concentration, compassion, and be able to use the energy that you have inside of you to be able to make a difference in the world. So practicing mindfulness is something that is nebulous to a lot of people. One, the negative connotation of that is a religion. Once you hear that, the first thing that people say, well, I'm committed to my religion and I need to not practice that religion. But it's not a religion. It's more of a lifestyle. That's what it was taught from the very beginning. And so if we were to go back to BC, sometime before BC, think about it, when we did not have books, what was the way that we were able to discover ourselves? And that was by sitting down and meditating and looking within and seeing what is inside of us. Because whenever we get lost, or whenever that we're lost in life, the key to finding yourself is by looking within, to finding your way back to where you need to find your way back to. So meditation is the remedy for self-care. Now, how do people implement this? Well, everyone, or should I say, the news, the most popular thing about mindfulness or meditation is jump into it for 5 minutes. Well, that is, you're misguiding people when you say that, because that's like telling a person that never worked out in their life to go to the gym and lift 200 pounds for the very first time. Now, they would go in and give it an attempt, but guess what? They would strain the whole time. The next day, they would say to themselves, I'm not going back. I'm not giving that a try ever again. So the way to start practicing mindfulness and meditation is by starting with seconds, because our life is lived from moment to moment. And we measure those moments by seconds, and those seconds add up to minutes and so forth. So you start off with 10 seconds, maybe 5 seconds of learning how to focus on one thing. And it can be love, it can be compassion, it can be self-care, it can be learning how to garden, to be able to feed yourself and not rely on a system, to provide you the health that you need, to provide you the food that you need. These are some of the things that we can make small investments in that will not cost us a lot of money and will save us time from going to fast food restaurants, which does not allow for our bodies to grow naturally. And I really want to say, if we really get beyond the stigma of learning how to practice mindfulness and meditation, and I think that we will evolve as human beings. So starting with 5 seconds, learning how to focus on one thing. And then from that 5 seconds increased to 10 seconds. And then from 10 seconds to 30 seconds. Now, and when you're able to hold your focus for 30 seconds without being distracted by so many things that we are distracted by in life, then you've just accomplished something and you've just made an incredible feat. So now the next thing is, now when you can learn how to focus for 60 seconds, what does that equate to? 1 minute. And from that 1 minute, then you build. So it's something that we have to, a tool that we need to use to be able to build ourselves from inside out. Because a lot of the trauma that has happened came from the external part of us, or an external part of the world, and it's been introduced to us in some of the most heinous ways. And so the way that we reverse engineer that is by learning to look within, start to love ourselves, be comfortable with whom we are, and then actually start using our energy and our mind and our spirit and our bodies to start implementing the things that we are trying to implement in the world, so we don't have to go through the red tape that's there, that'll stop us and make us think that we can't think beyond our circumstances and situations. So always look to practice your mindfulness, but having someone there is the key to helping everyone progress and grow in the direction of their ascension, to be able to evolve. It's just like, I use this sports terminology. It's like a team looking to win the championship, right? So everyone has to do their part. And so if everyone can start to learn how to focus on what they want to see themselves look like, how they want to see themselves look like, how they want their health to be, then guess what? The body and the mind starts to follow that action. And with all of the other distractions that are going on, that becomes a visual for everyone. And we share that same vision. And from there, we will be able to grow, just like how a seed is stuck in a fertile ground and blossoms into a beautiful flower. That's what we are. We all need the water. We all need the sun to be able to grow. And so that's, once people really start to understand that, and we start adapting the practice of mindfulness and meditation to help re-engineer or reverse engineer what's inside of us, then we will be able to grow exponentially.
Thanks, Prince. And I saw Jahmal send a note to the panelists about mindfulness, so he may want to incorporate that into his answer to his question. So this is your question, Jahmal. How do the activities you engage in with youth in Chicago help them adjust mentally to the challenges and pressures we've been talking about?
I mean, first of all, again, having me, but I feel like if I talk to a youth and I say, hey, what'd you do this weekend? The kids will be like, man, I had a good time, Jahmal. I ate some good food. I got to dance a little bit. I got to hang out with some other, would y'all have a barbecue? They'll say, oh, no, I just went to Leaks on 79th Street. This is the best funeral I've ever been to. The best funeral. These kids are in 9th grade and been to 15 funerals, right? If I talk to a kid the other day, he said, a teenager told me, he said, Jahmal, I don't put a lock on my iPhone no more. I said, well, why not? He said, because if I get killed, I want the police to know how to contact my people. Like, he wasn't thinking about where he's gonna be like 5 years from now. He said, I don't put a lock on my iPhone because if I get killed, I want the police to know how to contact my people. Like, and so the point I'm trying to make is that definitely being mindful. I always tell kids to be safe in Chicago, you gotta set goals. Like, goals create a force field around you. Like, goals tell you what to do and what not to do. Like, you're not jumping in that car with that dope dealer if you got go. Whoa, this ain't on my list of goals. Like, I don't know how it works, but I just know it does work. And I'm all about what Prince was just saying as far as planting seeds. I mean, even the Bible says that. It says that you you sow what you reap, or you reap what you sow. I think you reap like 3 times more than you sow. But if you plant spinach in the ground, like 6 months from now, you're not gonna get pumpkins. You know what I'm saying? Like, if you if you plant spinach, you're gonna get spinach. Now, if you don't like the conditions of that spinach 6 months from now, who's to blame come harvest time? The person that planted it, right? I say the same thing to youth. If you don't like the conditions of your grades come June, who's to blame come graduation time? You, man. Like, so it's like with youth in Chicago, man, it's all about saying, hey, man, I want you guys to come up out that I'm in the trenches mindset, right? Come about that I'm at war with the opposition mindset. You about to be 20 years old. You can't be in the field forever. And that same field you talk about is like the NFL draft. Every year, new recruits come and take your spot, right? And so, and then another thing you got to get through to them is saying that I know you might look at me as, or anybody that didn't grow up at your block, as an outsider. Because in Chicago, we're quick to tell people, oh, you ain't even from Chicago. You don't understand the struggles I had to deal with. And I'm like, come on, like I want to challenge youth on that mindset, because I feel like the white man laughs when he hears two black men arguing about whose struggle is more authentic, like whose block is more run down, whose neighborhood is more a jungle or all-time zoo. I heard some dudes arguing the other day. A dude said, hey, well, I went to jail for selling dope. You went to jail for breaking into a gas station. I got morals, I got standards, you know what I mean? And it's like, yo, I grew up around real ones. I ain't never told, I ain't never snitched. I'm a real nigga. It's like the white man is laughing at you, man. You with tears of gratefulness that you refuse to live up to your ancestry of being regal. Like teenagers, they've made it into a distinguished compliment to be a real nigga. Meanwhile, you gotta serve 15 years in jail because of your realness. It's unbelievable. They're laughing, saying, don't they realize that they should be working together instead of killing each other and fighting each other and trying to get their own? Or matter of fact, let them stay in the trenches. Let's get them some shovels to dig some more trenches, because they don't want to get shovels to build homes. And so I'm always trying to talk to kids and like challenge them and tell them that, when they always say, oh, you don't understand the struggle that I had. I say, yo, disappointments ain't reserved for you on 79th Street. Disappointments ain't reserved for you in Inglewood. Disappointments ain't reserved for you over East. It rains on people in the suburbs too. Now, we might get wet a little more because we don't have the umbrellas, right? But you ain't never gonna be dry if you stay in the trenches. You are always gonna be in the rain. You know what I mean? So I'm always challenging kids on their perspective, man. And that's kind of how I go about it with the youth in the city.
Thanks, Jahmal. I want to go back to something that Carl raised and ask a question that's relevant to that. And this is for everyone on the panel, although Carl raised it, but I'd like to hear from others on the panel about policies. And so the question is, what political policies or community resources do we need to make accessible to support, to make care more accessible to men of color?
Well, I could definitely start the conversation on that point. It's been an area of my research. I feel like in the city of Chicago, we have our priorities backwards. And it's unfortunate that when we talk about the need for resources, we all agree. We all agree that there is a need for more investment, there's a need for more resources, there's a need for more programming, but it all comes down to the dollar, right? So in the city of Chicago, we spend 40% of our city budget on policing. I mean, you can't do much else when 40% of your combined tax revenue that goes out to services gets put towards a police force. As a result, we have the biggest mental health hospital in Cook County Jail. So when we talk about policing, we're talking about $1.8 billion a year going to treat every social problem with a hammer. Right? So when we have $1.8 billion for hammers, we don't have much else for other resources, for other needs, for other, right? And so as a result, every crisis that gets, and my man Carl said it perfectly. I couldn't have said it better. I mean, absolutely right. In this society, we don't believe in human rights, right? In this society, we wait for things to become a major crisis and then we institutionalize, right? Either by police or by, medicalization. And so one of the policies that I've been supporting, endorsing, and we have been working with our elected officials in Chicago to do is to start peeling away from that $1.8 billion. Let's start with, I don't know, 100 million. 100 million off of 1.8 billion is less than the city pays police for overtime alone. Why do we have to pay police $139 million for overtime? And that was before, and we've spent through $139 million in overtime already by the month of June. Why? Because we have police respond to every social issue. So if we have, let's just say $100 million set aside, and we could start creating different responses to crises that are not about escalation or submission by force, what we could start thinking about is how do we start investing, let's just say $100 million into communities. What other cities have done, and this is the policy we're trying to push here in Chicago, what other cities have done is that they have created crisis response units that do not involve the police at all. I'm talking about Los Angeles, I'm talking about New York, I'm talking about Denver, right? I'm talking about small towns, Eugene and Oregon, 30 years ago realized maybe if we have a paramedic and a social worker respond to crises, the outcomes may actually end up in engaging people in supportive services when, again, you know, I don't know Chinese, but I heard that the Chinese character for crisis is also opportunity, right? So when people are dealing with a crisis, they might finally be ready to get services. But if we're throwing police at the problem, ain't nothing gonna change. We're seeing that currently. We're seeing countless examples now because of body cameras, now because of phone cameras. We're seeing the consequences of police responding to every crisis in our society. In this city, that has to change. So we have a council order that has been introduced by 9 aldermen that says, let's start with $100 million. Let's see what $100 million gets us. We have 5 public mental health clinics that remain. Let's make those the home bases to have crisis response teams that comprise of social workers and paramedics respond to crises. Let's have nonprofits, community-based organizations, community residents oversee these 5 clinics, have community-based advisory councils that oversee these 5 public clinics. In the same way, in this city of Chicago, we have a fire department. And for the same reason, we have a library system, because these are public resources that we all benefit from when we need them. So let's put some money up and start talking about solutions that take our own tax dollars, invest them in ways that can bring meaningful change in our communities. That's, to me, is at the core of the problem. Again, we cannot, and this has happened year after year after year in Chicago for generations. Look at the data. We invest per capita more money in policing in this city year after year, 20 years now later, than we did 20 years ago, and we're second largest per capita expenditure in policing in the entire country, right? Our crime and our shootings have not necessarily gone down as a result. So we have to start thinking of creative solutions and propose a vision of building a public infrastructure that can bring these resources to our community, pay social workers, pay therapists, pay people from the community to be part of the solution and create spaces of healing with good paying public jobs. So that's what we're proposing. That council order is headed to the health committee. Anyone who's interested in being a part of this advocacy effort, feel free to text me. And yeah, we have to create some meaningful, bold, new initiatives in the city.
Okay, well, let's stay on this question for a minute. But what I'd like to do is maybe reframe the question, because I thought about this a lot. So my approach is we need to have a broader discussion about public safety and what is the role of police in public safety. So the discussion seems to be skewed toward defunding the police, but not a discussion about what you've talked about how we fund some other things. For me, the discussion is really about public safety and what is the role of the police. And I think I see Donald getting ready. I don't know if I see him moving up. I don't know if that means he wants to answer the question. So I'll step back.
I'll be happy to answer the question, Joe. And again, I just appreciate all the responses of our participants today, because they've been right on point, right on time. It's just so much to say about everything that they've already indicated. First of all, in terms of the police, and I think that, you know, I see more African-American police at this point in time who are friends and family members that at any point that I've been on the planet. So I think that, you know, when we're just talking about the police from a generic perspective, we're also talking about colleagues and friends and folk that we went to college with. You know, I mean, there's relationships here. You know, there's a lot of activities that we've been engaged in with the Chicago Police Department over this past summer. We've been trying to also get people counted for the census. You know, we've had over 7 million contacts with folks involving the census. And, you know, the one thing that we've heard over and over again is a lack of trust, you know, of the system, a lack of trust, you know, of the police, you know, fear of the police, you know, concerns about the police, fear about government, fear about healthcare systems, and so on down the line. So I think that systemically, we've got to be able to look at what needs to occur to break through this cycle of generational trauma. You know, we're disproportionately represented when it comes to infant mortality, disproportionately represented when it comes to children, African-American children in particular, involved in the child welfare system. Disproportionately counted when it comes to juvenile justice systems. And I can go to every system like that and find that Black folks are disproportionately represented. And we're looking at constant disparities in healthcare and health access. So, you know, when we talk about systems, when we talk about being able to make things happen on, you know, several levels, we got to look at, you know, political change systemically. We got to look at the economic side of things. We got to look at the social side of things. We got to look at the technological impact, what's going on with technology. We've got to look at the legal systems of government out there, and environmental, because there's environmental concerns going on as well. But when it's happening, and happening in a very big way, we got to be identified and lifted up. I know that the Illinois Legislative Black Caucus right now are working, you know, and they're in the retreat phase right now, trying to come up with systemic solutions to battle institutional racism. I know that Cook County Commissioner Dennis Deere introduced a resolution at the county board that was passed unanimously to target institutional racism in county government, and got that measure passed all across the country. So I think that from a systems point of view, we got to look at each one of those aspects and really attack each one individually. Let me also just simply say that when we look at, you know, certain interventions such as mindfulness and meditation, that, you know, we've been working with the Chicago Police Department, rather than taking folk to jail, Cook County Jail, and to the emergency room and inpatient psych wards, bring them to the triage center so that we can do the type of assessment and get a full comprehensive assessment of what the real and true need is, as opposed to sending them back into these systems. You know, we've got folks that are 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year that can do that level of assessment. And, you know, in the Baltimore school system, it's been reported that rather than sending children to detention, they're teaching them how to meditate and engage in mindfulness. You know, for the brothers in recovery, I've been saying to them, yes, you know, I understand the 12-step program, and that's certainly has its benefits. But one of the tenets of that particular system is 1 day at a time. I submit it's not 1 day at a time anymore. We don't have that long to wait. You know, it's really one moment at a time. In one moment of life, you can make a decision that can make you a victim or victorious. You know, so what we're saying right now is master the moment. Master the moment and do what is in your best interest in that moment to lift up your community and lift up your family. And let me also just say that civic engagement is key. As we talked about the importance of being counted, that you matter, we're trying to segue that into people voting. Why? Because we understand from a historical perspective that when we vote, voting helps to overcome traumatic effects.
Yeah, I'm gonna let Carl weigh in, and I think Jahmal might have something to say as well. So we're about close to the end, so I'm gonna give an opportunity for Carl to speak, and then if Jahmal has something to say, then we'll go to him. Only got about 10 minutes left, so.
I'll be real brief. Thank you, Joseph. And just piggybacking on what everyone else is saying, going back to sort of approaching this from a structural change, especially with police, the one thing we have to remember with cops is, regardless of our politics or policies on cops, the reason that they are the de facto social prosecutors for all of our issues is because the public deferred to them. You know, mental health services didn't get shut down in the darkness of night. Those were 2 consecutive dailies, openly shutting down services just as quick as they were shutting down schools, all in the name of saving revenues. And mental health care is not just making sure cops are treating us civically and socially appreciated. Mental health care is also access to food. Mental health care is access to safe housing. Mental health care are streets that are healthy for individuals who may find themselves at job loss, who may be at risk of sex trafficking, who may be at risk of abuse and domestic violence within the home. So we've largely deferred a lot of different responsibilities for any number of reasons, and cops just ended up being the janitors of it. You know, so for all the faults and shortcomings that there might be from a personality standpoint with policing. A lot of this didn't just happen out of the blue. So when we talk about what would need to be changed, when you talk about like a thing like a defunding, it's, you know, we understand why we use that term, but the reappropriating funds to invest in trying to minimize food scarcities and food deserts and provide food that way. Creating subsidies for affordable housing and underwriting housing services for the elderly, for, you know, think about how many kids are coming out of the foster system who age out, who suddenly end up on the streets. You're talking about in America, that's almost 50 to 60,000, you know, almost every month end up aging out of the system across the country. In Chicago, that's something like 4,000 or 5,000 in Northern Illinois age out every year. Who, you know, and how many of those 18-year-olds to 20 to 25 end up in places like homelessness and things like that. Mental health services and improving access also starts young. There should be no reason that if you can cough up $1.8 billion, you talk about 100 million, underwriting lunch programs and breakfast programs in schools should not even be a question. And providing that sort of stability is part of the collective mental health experience, providing wellness and removing the toxic stress of poverty from young men and women. And let's just focus on men. Removing the toxic stress of poverty for young men in this city would probably go a very long line in the route of prohibiting or helping those young men prevent themselves from getting to a point of feeling hopeless, angry, or looking at the idea of violence as a healthy or acceptable outcome, behavioral outcome for any number of different issues they may face. That doesn't fix all the problems, but when we talk about policing, sometimes we get lost. We think of the trees and lose the forest, and that cops are just a manifestation of a lot of societal failures that are on our part to correct. You know, they're just they become the spear tip of that's connected to a pole of failings from a social policy standpoint of us building the willpower to direct our resources in better places.
Thanks a lot, Carl. Jahmal, did you have something you wanted to add?
Just that these guys are geniuses on the call, and I agree with policy changes. I'm more in the lane of personality changes, because I mean, I'm like my block, my hood, my city, we operate at the grassroots and in between bureaucracy. Like, we're good in that space. Say that I will say, when I was breaking into houses and stuff, like, I don't know if a policy could have stopped. Like, look, the first time I ever tasted lasagna was when I broke into a house, right? And when I broke into it and saw the lasagna in the refrigerator, I ate a piece and I was like, this is what it tastes like to be rich. You know what I mean? Like, we used to break into houses for like pineapples and blueberries and capping, weird stuff. The first time I ever got caught stealing, I stole a trapper keeper, and my dad was proud of me. He said I was going to be the president because I was stealing a protractor and a trapper keeper, right? So I didn't like, I feel like I'm more about, you know, positive role models, and I'm more about what's something simple you can do to make a positive impact in your block. You know what I mean? Like, what's something simple you can do to make a difference? And I think anybody, you know, you don't have to be a politician to make a difference. I don't feel like you have to have a law degree to listen to people, right? I just think you have to just have a heart full of love, you know what I mean? And want to give back. So as I get older and as I, you know, give me some time, I'm learning more about, you know, policy changes. And I've took a lot of notes in this call, and I'm very appreciative, man. And I look forward to building relationships with you guys so we can try to connect the grassroots with the policy. So thank you.
Thank you, Jahmal. Well, I want to wrap up the panel, and actually what I want to do is I want to close with some reflections, and I'm going to use one word to maybe sum up what I thought about as I listened to the different panelists, and it's one word, and one word came to me: resilience. And we are, and I'm talking about Black and brown men, we're very resilient, and sometimes we forget that. I'm going to tell a brief story about a good friend of mine, Dr. Roderick Pugh. He was born in 1919. Unfortunately, he died in 2010. He attended Fisk University. But to give some more background, his father was a slave that became a doctor and wanted his son to become a doctor. Rod went to Fisk University. He graduated cum laude in 1940. He went on to earn a master's degree at Ohio State University. He enlisted in the Army. he attained the rank of second lieutenant under General George S. Patton. He studied psychology under Dr. Carl Rogers at the University of Chicago and got his PhD degree in 1949. And one of the things that Rod told me is all of the characteristics that people have that deem themselves mentally healthy, the same thing can happen to us. We can fall into what we deem mental health or have a behavioral health problem. We're all just one step away, and maybe one catalyst, one thing going wrong, something bad happening in our lives that can change our lives forever. But the men that are on this panel have been resilient, even though they've struggled and they've had problems. The other person I want to invoke is Dr. Carl Bell. And Donald Dew brought up his name as well. And I knew Dr. Bell very well. And one of the things that Carl was known for saying is risk factors are not predictive factors because of protective factors. Each of us has had somebody in our lives that has helped us and moved us along, either a mentor, a friend, or somebody that turned us around when we were engaged in behavior we shouldn't have been, or at least pointed us in the right direction moving forward. So I think picking up what Jahmal said, we really need to find more people, more men of color that want to be mentors and want to be actively engaged in their communities. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Laura to close us out.
Can I just mention one thing and just say that prevention is better than the cure? Just always remember that.
Right.
Thank you. Thank you, Prince. Thank you, Joe, for those great closing words. And thank all of you. This hour went by way too quickly. I would love to hear more from each and every one of you. So I hope we really continue the conversation. As I mentioned earlier, today's program was brought to you by Community Health. All of your ticket sales or donations that you have made today or prior to this program will support Community Health's mission to serve those without essential health care. Please consider making a contribution now to support Community Health. Instructions are on your screen, and I'll ask my colleague Nina to drop a link into the chat for you as well. On behalf of the staff, board of directors, and volunteers at Community Health, I want to thank you all for being part of our All in Chicago event series. I hope that you are all leaving today with ideas for how we can work together to make the vision of access to care for all Chicagoans a reality. We have just one more event coming up this week, our All In celebration. It is free to attend, so please join us as we wrap up this incredible month. I encourage you to check out our website, allin-chicago.org, to learn more. We all have a critical role to play in this effort. Thank you for being part of today's event.